We walked along a path through the woods, calling to Uncle Feather. "Where are you, dummy?" We used all his favorite expressions, but he didn't answer. There was no sound except for the foghorn in the distance. "Uncle Feather's just playing a game, right?" Fudge asked. "Let's hope." The path led us down to the water. There were a couple of houses overlooking the harbor, but it was too foggy to see any of the boats. "We'll start here," I told Fudge, stopping in front of an old white house with black shutters. We climbed the steps to the front porch. "I'll talk," Fudge said. "He's my bird." "Okay, but don't waste a lot of time." I rang the bell. A woman about Grandma's age came to the door. "Have you seen Uncle Feather?" Fudge asked, getting right to the point. "Uncle who?" she said. "Uncle Feather," Fudge repeated. "Why, no. At least I don't think so. But come in out of the fog and tell me all about him." We followed her to the kitchen. "You can call me Mrs. A," she told us. "My husband and I live here all year round. Where are you boys staying?" "Through the woods," Fudge said. "We have a swing." "Oh, yes, I've noticed a whole gang at that house. There's a Mommy and Daddy and Tootsie and Grandma," Fudge said, ticking off names on his fingers. "And Buzzy Sr., Sheila, Libby, Mr. and Mrs. Tubman, Turtle, Jake, Uncle Feather, and me and my brother, Pete. This is Pete," he said, pointing at me. "He's not supposed to talk." Mrs. A looked at me. "That sore throat is going around," she said. "I had it myself last week. What you need is some hot tea with lemon and honey." Before I had the chance to explain that my throat wasn't sore, Fudge made himself comfortable at the kitchen table. "Something smells good," he said. Mrs. A set out a plate of cinnamon rolls. "Fresh from the oven," she told him. "And I'll bet you could use a nice hot cup of cocoa, too." "I could," Fudge said. "I didn't have any breakfast." "Why, that's terrible," Mrs. A said. "On a morning like this, you need a big, hot breakfast." I tugged at the sleeve of Fudge's slicker, reminding him that we didn't have time to waste if we were going to find Uncle Feather. But he ignored me. Mrs. A poured Fudge a cup of cocoa. Then she poured me a cup of tea. She stirred in a spoon of honey and squeezed the juice from a lemon wedge. "That should fix your sore throat," she said. I didn't tell her that when I'm sick I like Moe's herb tea, or that Fudge's cocoa smelled so good I could feel my mouth watering. There are times when it's better not to say anything. Mrs. A joined us at the table. She helped herself to a cinnamon roll. "I can't resist them," she explained, with a guilty look on her face. "This is good cocoa," Fudge said, slurping it with a spoon. "Thank you, Mrs. A. Mitzi says my cocoa's the best." "Who's Mitzi?" Fudge asked. "My granddaughter. She's 5. "I'm 5 too," Fudge said. "Well, you'll have to come by and meet her. She'll be here tomorrow." "Okay," Fudge said. "I'm getting married soon, but I can still have friends, right?" "That's right," Mrs. A said. "Everybody needs friends." She didn't ask Fudge about getting married. Instead, she watched, fascinated, as he unwound his cinnamon roll and picked out all the raisins. He piled them up in the corner of his plate. Finally, Mrs. A said, "I certainly hope your uncle's not out sailing in this weather." "I hope not too," Fudge said, "because he doesn't know how to sail." "Oh dear, he's not even supposed to go outside." "This sounds serious," she said. "Have you called the police?" "Not yet," Fudge said. "We called the search and rescue team." "Are they coming soon?" she asked him. They're already here," he told her. "That's a relief," she said. "What does your uncle look like, in case I see someone who fits his description?" He's mostly black with yellow feet and a yellow nose, Fudge said, stuffing the last of the cinnamon roll into his mouth. Mrs. A seemed surprised by Fudge's description. I could tell she was thinking hard. Then her face lit up and she waved her hands around. Oh, I get it. Your uncle's a scuba diver? Does Uncle Feather know how to dive? Fudge asked me. I'm not sure, I said, getting up from the table. But we've really got to go if we're going to find him. When we got to the front door, Mrs. A took me aside and whispered, Is your uncle all right? Upstairs? She tapped the side of her head in case I didn't get her point. Hard to say, I whispered back. Then I shoved Fudge out the front door. Thanks for the snack. Come back tomorrow, Mrs. A called. Okay, Fudge said. As soon as we were away from the house, I grabbed Fudge by the arm. Why didn't you tell her Uncle Feather's a bird? She knows that, Fudge said. How does she know? Everybody knows Uncle Feather is a bird. No, she thinks he's your uncle. My uncle, Fudge said, laughing. That's really silly, right? That's why you should have told her. She thinks this guy running around in a black wetsuit and yellow flippers and a yellow face mask, this guy who's a little weird upstairs, I tapped the side of my head the way Mrs. A had, and that he's your uncle. Come on, Pete. That's what she thinks. She doesn't know Uncle Feather is a mynah bird because you didn't tell her. You have to give the facts, and you have to say, my mynah bird is missing. He's mostly black with yellow feet and a yellow bill, not nose. I told him. People have noses. Birds have bills. Get it? She made good cocoa. If you stop for cocoa at every house, we're never going to find him. Never? Never. Fudge started crying. That's not going to help. I dragged him along the rocky beach, hoping we'd hear Uncle Feather calling to us. But there's no sound except the waves breaking against the rocks. We went to 3 more houses along the water, and Fudge made it clear that his mynah bird was missing, but no one had seen Uncle Feather, although they all promised to keep a lookout for him. So we trudged back to our house. Sheila was watching for us in the living room window. She opened the door. Did you find him? She asked. No, I said. Fudge sniffled. Then he covered his face with his hands and lay down on the floor, still wearing his yellow slicker and a rain hat. We were quiet for a while. I guess all 3 of us were thinking about Uncle Feather, alone, lost and frightened. Suddenly, we heard a piercing scream. Fudge jumped up and grabbed Sheila. I dashed to the hall closet, looking for something to use as a weapon, just in case. But before I could even grab an umbrella, we heard another scream. This time, Sheila and Fudge crawled under the table. Then Libby tore through the house, yelling, Help! There's a bat after me! She raced around the living room. There was more noise and confusion as Libby bumped into furniture and knocked over a lamp. Not that she stopped for a minute. She kept screeching and running in circles. I heard the sound of flapping wings. When I looked up, I saw something black flying after Libby. That's when I realized Libby wasn't the only one screeching. Stop, I shouted. But Libby didn't listen. That's no bat, I yelled at her, and I started running. That's Uncle Feather. My bird? Fudge said from under the table. Yes, Turkey Brain, your bird. Fudge and Sheila came out hiding and joined the chase. It didn't take long before everyone else in the house came to see what was happening. Tootsie, who's a good screecher herself, joined right in. Eee! She screeched as loud as she could, which got Uncle Feather going again. You 4 are going to have to play more quietly, Mrs. Tubman said. We're not playing, Libby screamed. Ee! Tootsie kept it up. Everybody, freeze, Dad shouted. Just freeze, right where you are. Libby froze, and I crashed into her. Fudge crashed into me. Sheila crashed into Fudge. Uncle Feather flew across the room. He perched on top of his cage and looked over us. Silly, 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 he called. Then he hopped into his cage, and Buzzy Sr. closed the door. We untangled ourselves. Sheila looked at me. All's well that ends well, right? Yeah, Pete, Fudge said. All's well that ends well. Then he turned 2 somersaults and landed in my lap.